All right. So the third element of the rhetorical, or excuse me, the current event or the rhetorical précis is the bias identification. And this is where you're looking at the source itself, so both where it was published and the author, to identify any potential bias. So, because when you read, as you're assessing or thinking about the information, you really should be thinking about where this information came from. And this is born from, and some of you have been burned by this, like with the SMINC stuff. So you never want to be in that situation again where you're sminked or led astray or led to believe something even though someone has a particular bias in it. So before you actually write the analysis, you need to research any potential bias of the author and or the source. So yes, it does say research. And so you're going to have to do a quick Google search of the author or authors. So for example, if you were reading, like for the Jeff Smink, you spent 2 minutes to look up who the heck Jeff Smink is. And like we did in David Brooks, you spend 5 seconds figuring out what the heck David Brooks or who that person is. Now the source is also the publication, okay? Because as I showed you on the first page, that publications definitely have bias. So if it is published in the New York Times, there's going to tend to be more of a liberal bias because they have been noted in their opinions from their editorial board, not their editors, or not the opinion writers, the editorial board, tend to be more liberal. And so you can even see a little bit of that influence in Brooks, even though he's a conservative. What he talks about is something that both liberals and conservatives could agree upon. And so they're not going to publish something that is so contradictory or something that would be so against what they believe. So there's going to be influence there. If Fox News is not going to publish something that contradicts what their editorial board or what those journalists believe. So you should look up and see what kind of bias these particular sources have. And so that would simply be like literally Googling Fox News, bias, or Christian Science Monitor, bias. There's going to be tons of websites that provide you some context so that you can be more informed. So when you're looking at this, when you're identifying bias, you should include any relevant information about the writer, like if he or she is a guest writer associated with an outside party, like Smink was. If we would have done this bias identification, we could have very easily identified very quickly that this is what Smink spends his time doing. This is what he does. He doesn't write for New York Times, but he definitely does write for and about and work with or on student learning materials. So also, if it's not someone that's a guest writer, the journalist will have other articles that he or she has worked on in the past. So for example, if I'm reading an article about a prosthetic arm that's a breakthrough, then I should probably look at this writer. Has he or she written on other technology sources? If he or she hasn't, then I might be concerned that he or she might not have the background, because a lot of this is very specific knowledge. For example, if I'm going to research something about the refugee crisis in Europe, I might want to look to see if my journalist is my journalist actually in Europe right now? Is my journalist in Hungary or in Germany, to see what the general opinion is of the people? Has my journalist written other articles on the refugee crisis? That's going to be something that makes he or she more reliable because they're more knowledgeable. If one day he or she writes about the refugee crisis, and then the next day he or she writes about the Iran deal, and then he or she writes about the 9/11 memorial, then it just seems like they write whatever's most important of the day, which doesn't make them not credible, but it makes them just journalists, right? So they don't have any particular bias, but they also don't have they don't have good background knowledge. And so keeping in mind that bias simply identifies what standing or what should I be aware of about the author in this particular piece. And sometimes you're going to find that, no, there's nothing, not a big deal. And other times you're going to say, yes, this has a serious impact. And you'll oftentimes see this bias come through. Same thing with publications. So maybe the author itself doesn't have any bias, but if it's published in the National Review, you might want to consider probably has more of a conservative slant to it. That perhaps the author doesn't write about anything that's too liberal or seems like a knowledgeable source about a particular topic, but if he or she is published on Huffington Post, they tend to be pretty liberal. So the publication source will also, you'll want to identify you'll want to identify bias. So if there is no writer listed, obviously look to the institution, so that would be the publication. Explain why this background is important to note. So why do I care about the bias? So what? Who cares? For example, if you wrote about Smink, you'd have to tell me, why do I care that Smink has bias there? And you'd have to be able to articulate, you should be knowledgeable that that Smink is the vice president of the Summer Learning Association, because the whole article advocates for a reform in summer learning, not a complete revamp, but reforming a system that's already there. He clearly has some stock in this, or has he will benefit from this, and so it makes the reader question or be more wary or consider that as they read. So you need to be able to articulate why I care about this bias. So you will need to do some background research. Yes, you will. Yes, you will. A Google search, it's so nice to be able to search something on Google so quickly. You can get this bias research done in about 5 minutes, and it'll take you maybe 5 to 10 minutes to write this little piece there. So, and here's an example, identifying, and notice how this example identifies the author. Leonard Pitts Jr. has been and continues to be an opinion writer, so I've identified what his role is, and the opinion writer focuses on race, culture, and politics. So that's his general, what he writes about, and he has been awarded many accolades for his writing, including the Pulitzer Prize in 2004. Wow. So actually, winning the Pulitzer Prize, if I didn't know what the Pulitzer Prize was, then I would look it up. But since I know what it is, it's a very prestigious award for writing in journalism, that this is someone that at least has been awarded or rewarded by his peers for being a good journalist or a good writer, because he's an opinion writer. Then there's the switch to the publication. The Baltimore Sun covers both local and national news, but it is read by viewers across the nation. So notice how I'm specifically identifying the audience here. Who reads this? So if I was talking about Star Tribune, that's mostly it does have local and national news in it, and international news, but that's not a nationally syndicated publication. That's not read by readers across the nation. That's a regional publication that, and in fact, it's only the urban Minnesota that reads it, and maybe the outskirts of Wisconsin. But you're not, I mean, I grew up in the northern Minnesota. I didn't even hear of the Star Tribune until I moved to the cities when I was 18. So look up who is this typical reader, where's the readership? And then, so the next line, even though a reader can see that Pitts is a critic of the current culture, there is no bias that seems to impact the content of the article. So at the end, the student is saying, like, here's why you care, or here's why it doesn't really matter. Like, like, even though, yes, he does seem like a crabby old man in here, there's no bias that seems to impact the content. So it's totally okay to say that, no bias. Or you would say that here is the bias and here's how it impacts the article. So you will be doing some research, but that's basically a rundown of the bias identification.